Before Waterloo, many great empires had already risen and fallen at the point of their swords, yet Napoleon and Wellington had never met in battle. This confrontation had been a long time in coming. Seen through the grand sweep of history, it appeared almost inevitable that these two men would clash. But why here, and why now? Sometimes history unleashes events that no writer of fiction would dare to imagine. This is one such case. Born months apart in the same year of 1769, these mortal enemies seemed linked together by personal destiny, the fate of their nations, and military genius. From birth, they seemed to lead parallel lives that would ultimately converge in cataclysm at Waterloo. As a matter of blood and honor, they would bring to the battle everything they had learned, everything they had endured, and everything that had made up their lives to that time. It had taken 46 years to happen. Napoleon Bonaparte was a product of Corsica, an island located off the coast of France, known for its extreme beauty and its extreme treachery. He claimed to have an instinct for war, perhaps because he was born to it. His pregnant mother dodged bullets in these mountains during one of the island's frequent battles with France for independence. The Bonapartes lived in the port city of Ajaccio, a descendant of ancient Italian nobility. Napoleon's father, Carlo, was a prominent attorney. His mother, Letizia, was one of the most attractive and influential women on the island. On August 15th, 1769, in severe labor, she left this cathedral in the middle of High Mass and made her way home. Reaching the family estate just minutes away, she was too far along with the pregnancy to walk up the stairs to her bedroom. Instead, around noon, she gave birth to Napoleon on this sofa in a downstairs sitting room. He was a bright, charismatic child. He grew up in this fine house. His young parents, although far from rich, managed to keep up the appearances expected of someone with their noble background. As a boy, he has been described as strong-willed, generous, and always ready for a scrap. This was in keeping with his Corsican background, for although his name would forever be linked with France, his roots were here. For the rest of his life, he would carry with him both the greatness of the island and its dark side. A dark side where pride, honor, and violence walked hand in hand. A dark side where vendettas and duels were a way of life. From the cradle, Corsican boys learned a view of manhood where force and honor were often one and the same. This would forever color Napoleon's view of the world. At the age of 9, it was decided he would be sent off to military school in France. No one could possibly have imagined at that time the epic grandeur, greatness, and accomplishment that would follow, or the tragedy, the destruction, and the million dead bodies he would leave in his wake, all in the name of peace and ambition. Across Europe and Ireland, another island of beauty and treachery, Wellington was born. At birth, his given name was Arthur Wesley. The title Duke of Wellington was bestowed on him years later, after his spectacular military successes. His father, Garrett Wesley, was a British earl and a celebrated violinist. His mother, Anne Hill, was the daughter of a prominent banker. The family moved to England, where young Wellington was enrolled in the elite private school of Eton in 1781. As an adult, he would rise to rule the British Empire, but as a schoolboy, his future looked grim. It's ironic that one of the most famous quotes attributed to Wellington is the statement that the Battle of Waterloo was won in the playing fields of Eton. He probably never said it.
Most historians do not believe that that sounds at all like anything Wellington ever said. The best evidence from his days at Eton, he simply wasn't a joiner. He just didn't go out into the playing field and want to join in any kind of game with his comrades. He hung back. I don't think that they thought he was very smart.
The situation became so desperate that his mother sent him off to military school in France at the Angers Academy of Equitation. During this time, a career in the army was often the last stop before oblivion for the failing youth of British aristocracy. She confided that he was food for gunpowder and nothing more. Once in a military environment, though, his metamorphosis was astonishing.
This was a very formative period in his life. He learned to ride very well, and it made a man of him. I think he enjoyed the army. And it certainly helped to enormously influence the way he conducted his life and so on. I think he needed the impetus of something like the army to get him going.
Across France, at the same time, Napoleon was attending the Brienne Military Academy. The two schools never engaged in competition, so the two boys never met. Unlike Wellington, Napoleon had no problem getting started. Although his grades were imperfect, his potential seemed unlimited.
Napoleon probably was a genius. He had an amazing brain capacity. Along with his study of things military, he picked up along the way politics and philosophy, and his brain just sucked all this up like a sponge. And it was as if he had a computer in there that he could just draw on for anything that he needed. It was like going to a great library and just picking a book out.
His personality at school was described as granite heated by a volcano. Brienne attracted boys from the richest and most aristocratic families in France. They showed little respect for the young Corsican upstart born of lower nobility.
Napoleon is already showing the signs of his great pride that is going to carry him on through his life. He's constantly in fights, fighting his way for his own pride. He has the Corsican in him. He has the accent. It's seen by the other boys. It's for another thing that they pick on him for. But he will fight his way out and will not back down to anyone.
Yet for all the turmoil that swirled around him, he was always the leader. Legend has it, he would be called out of the library to take command in snowball fights. With ease, he would outsmart and outgeneral the opposing team, and then go back to his studies. He never seemed to lose. He graduated next at the prestigious École Militaire. This was exactly the right training ground that would allow him to fuel his enormous ambition.
I think from a very early age, Napoleon saw the military as his route to the top. He approached the army as a business, and he was going to learn everything about that business that he could.
He was attracted to the military like many other young cadets, for reasons of glory, patriotism, and adventure. But as usual, he took it one step beyond his comrades. For he already believed he had secret weapons, these being his extraordinary intelligence and a fate that would lead him to unequaled glory.
He's already reading the campaigns and studying the campaigns of the great men who've gone before. He's reading about Alexander and his conquest of the world. He's reading about Hannibal and his march across the Alps into Italy. And so he is studying them, looking to see what has made these men great, what has allowed them to conquer the way they have, to stand up against great odds and still achieve victory.
All his time wasn't spent in the library, though. His other study was firepower. He trained in the artillery. For along with his scholarly side, he knew that the key to dominating any situation would come through a knowledge of firearms. It would help him become a master of the art of war.
So he takes what would be called in those days the dirty, grubby job of being an artilleryman, of actually pushing cannon around, of learning about cannon, of learning how they work, learning what a struggle it is for the men to get them into position. And so it's there by fortuitous chance, the serendipity, that artillery and Napoleon are married together.
Normally, a cadet spent 2 years at the academy. Napoleon passed through the program in 1. He became an officer at the age of 16 years, 15 days. Back in Ireland now, Wellington was commissioned in the British Army and appointed aide-de-camp to the Irish Viceroy. By the age of 21, through his family, he also attained a seat in the Irish Parliament. Although serious and enormously ambitious, his youth sometimes showed.
Wellington was part of a set that lived fast and hard. There was gambling, there were sports, horse racing. It was an age when life was uncertain, and the idea of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die was very much the order of the day.
This lifestyle took a turn for him, though, when he met Catherine Pakenham. 3 years his junior, she was one of the most beautiful women on the island. He was immediately enchanted with her, but was destined to spend the next 3 years constantly being rebuffed. The problem wasn't love, it was money. Wellington's family, although titled and with property, had squandered much of its fortune on frivolous and fast living. Many marriages during this time were arranged, just like business deals. Her family added up the figures and decided the young officer wasn't bringing enough to the table. The answer was no. He spent some time floundering now and would never get her out of his mind. Luckily, his salvation and his first taste of glory would come with an assignment to the exotic and distant battlefields of India. Across the Channel in France, Napoleon was rising to glory amidst the chaos of the French Revolution. He believed in a French republic and fought against royalists who wanted to restore the recently fallen monarchy. The turmoil was so great in France that the country was not only at war with itself, it was also simultaneously battling other European powers on its borders who had become involved in reinstating the old monarchy. The feeling amongst the crowned heads of Europe being, if the French monarchy was totally crushed, they too would be in jeopardy. In 1793, at the French seaport of Toulon, Napoleon masterminded a brilliant attack against the pro-royalist British fleet anchored there. Against impossible odds, his troops drove the British from a fort and their fleet from the harbor. In battle, he seemed almost fearless, often leading the charges himself.
He was not a follower, he was a leader. And because of this, and this sort of dauntless view that a bullet was not meant to kill him, some sort of feeling he had about himself, some sense of destiny, whatever it is that was in that sense of genius he had, he was always out there as the great risk-taker.
For his heroics at Toulon, he was made Brigadier General at the tender age of 24. Yet the power structure of France was changing so rapidly at this time that you could be a hero on the winning side 1 month, and weeks later, be a hunted criminal on another side gained favor. Napoleon rode this roller coaster to its highest peaks and lowest valleys. Less than a year after his heroics at Toulon, he hit rock bottom.
For a while, he was put in prison. Once he was out of prison, even though still a general, he had no employment and no money. He was wandering the street in rags virtually, and even contemplated suicide.
He was rescued from his fate, and he was called in to protect the Republic Convention from mobs of angry royalist supporters. Firing his cannons at point-blank range, he defended the convention while driving the royalists from the streets. In some people's eyes, he had saved the revolution. His myth was growing. In return for his accomplishment, he was handed command of the French army fighting in Italy. At the same time, he met Josephine.
What is your strange power, incomparable Josephine, Napoleon Bonaparte?
Josephine de Bonnaret was a beautiful woman who had lost her husband in the Revolution. As a member of glittery Parisian society, she spent her days moving from party to party and salon to salon. Intelligent, ambitious, and calculating, she was a woman who knew what she wanted and how to get it. Napoleon had had numerous affairs with other women, but in Josephine, he found his ideal.
Napoleon fell almost instantly in love with her. I mean, here was the ideal woman for him. She was the epitome of grace, elegance, style. She screamed class from every pore, and Napoleon was always attracted to class.
Napoleon sought to control every situation in his life, every relationship, every business meeting, every sport he participated in. Eventually, he even sought to control the world. But Josephine was the one thing, the one person he could not control.
Do I love him? Well, no. What I feel is tepidness. Josephine de Beauharnais.
I don't think that she was in love with him. I think she saw him as one of the many possibilities, and of course his star continued to go up. She's not getting any younger. She's had 2 children. I think she took a chance. I think she grew to love him in the way that adult people do and have special relationships, as life goes on.
On March 9th, 1796, they were married. In time, their relationship would develop into one of the great and most tragic romances of history. Now in far-off India, Wellington was getting an intense lesson in 18th century warfare. Colonial duty here, for any British soldier, represented combat in its most exotic form. It seemed almost every month a new foe had to be faced, each one of them intent on forcing their will on Britain's powerful East India Company.
It was a wild, exotic place, much more so than he'd even imagined it would be. And he's put to the test in so many ways during his time there. You got the Mohammedan sect, you got Islamic influences, you got Hindu influences, all of them clashing continually with European culture. So all these wild enemies of the English, whether armed with arrows or armed with elephants or armed with European-style weaponry, are going to be facing off against Wellington.
In the field, he created many new innovations himself.
He learnt the necessity of good supply system at that time. He created an intelligence system. His great contribution also was he was a tremendous trainer of infantry. And also, he laid down very strict guidelines for the welfare of the soldiers. That they should be properly clothed, properly fed, properly trained. And this, of course, paid tremendous dividends later on.
One character trait that surfaced in India and would stay with him forever was a seeming distrust of other people's advice.
Usually he checked on everybody the whole time. He could not really believe very many people giving him complete trust. He tended to know everything himself.
Wellington always found a way to beat his enemy. He's going to say that everything he needed to know in fighting a battle, he learned in India. He learns that in each different campaign, he has to come about it in a different manner.
His success in protecting British trade interests in India was spectacular. He was awarded knighthood for his efforts. Across the Alps in Italy in 1796, Napoleon's army sought out and clashed with enemy troops who were still trying to force France to restore its pre-revolution monarchy. Foremost among these foes were the armies of Austria and Piedmont. His campaign began with a rocky start, for he found his army ill-fed, ill-equipped, ill-paid, and undermanned. Not to mention the fact that some of the officers he was commanding were nearly twice his age and had twice the experience. Yet these obstacles did not seem to bother him.
Napoleon had great belief in himself and his own ability. In Italy, he used this, and he used every shot in his arsenal of man management, cajoling, persuading, being extremely friendly with people, being very harsh with people, screaming at them, whatever it took to get the men to follow him. And this magic worked. It was what we would call today, perhaps, star quality. He did things that no one else could do because he was who he was.
The ragged army began to turn around. All who saw him could see that he was a general who was going to go on the ride of a lifetime, and he made them feel as if they were going to go along too. Just like Wellington, Napoleon was obsessed with theories of battle. Now the time had come for him to put his concepts into practice. Leading many of the charges himself, he defied long-held military convention and revolutionized the rules of war forever.
Before war had been a gentleman's game. Two armies line up on a field and they pound away at each other until one side gives. Not Napoleon. He's not going to take it while the other side's giving it. He's going to force it all upon the enemy. He divides their forces, crushes one wing, and then goes after the other. It's not like anybody has seen before.
Everything he did was innovative. Everything he did worked. And in less than a year, he defeated 4 armies, each larger than his own. In India, Wellington also continued to go from victory to victory. Yet rather than the euphoria that came over Napoleon after winning, Wellington seemed to have a cloud of melancholy descend upon him after each victory. Few would call him emotional, but the price in human lives that was paid for each of his successes truly seemed to affect him. Although he had become a master of war, he seemed acutely aware of the inherent tragedy that accompanied his chosen profession. Victory affected Napoleon differently. His fabulous success in Italy fueled even more his belief that his life was different, that he was somehow touched with a greater destiny than that of any other man. In the midst of one battle, he seemed to glimpse the future.
I saw the world spin away beneath me, as if I were borne up in the air. Napoleon Bonaparte.
At this time, Napoleon was getting a great view of himself as something above the crowd. To an extent, he was believing his own publicity. But he knew that he could do things that other people couldn't. He had a vision that he was not subject to the rules of ordinary men, and that he could mold France, and eventually mold Europe, to his vision of the ideal society, with, of course, himself as the head.
In his personal life, though, he was not the conquering hero. Madly in love, he was puzzled by his wife's lack of response to the letters he sent home. Unknown to him was the fact that back in Paris, Josephine was having numerous affairs. Before leaving Italy, Napoleon spread some of the French Revolution's reforms and then returned home, now one of France's greatest national heroes. Some thought he could do anything by this time, and an invasion of France's mortal enemy, Britain, was considered. But he wisely sidestepped the task, and instead turned his eye to invading Egypt. If conquered, it would help destroy England's commerce with the Middle East, and jeopardize their trade routes to India. Egypt, that most mysterious of all lands. He was already aware, of course, of its fabled past. For centuries, the greatest of all nations in the ancient world. The land of the pharaohs. The land of the pyramids. The land of the Nile. The land his hero Alexander the Great had conquered over 2,000 years earlier. Like Wellington in India, Napoleon relished the thought of military service in an exotic land. He reached Egypt in July of 1798 and quickly took Alexandria. Then, in the spectacular Battle of the Pyramids, he destroyed additional Egyptian forces in a matter of 2 hours. But although he was a conqueror and a soldier of fortune, here in Egypt, he was also a scholar with a great reverence toward the culture. Those who saw him described almost a euphoric spell the land cast over him. His actions here clearly showed both sides of his complex personality. The magic land had such a tremendous pull on his intellectual nature that before leaving France, he had assembled a second army to accompany him. But this one was not meant for fighting.
He's also taken an army of scientists, of philosophers, to go and study the Orient. This is the land that the knowledge has come from, and so Napoleon is bent on recovering some of that knowledge. These scientists and philosophers are working throughout the land, finding all kinds of great riches that will come back and enlighten all of Europe. One of the things they find is the Rosetta Stone, now in the British Museum in London. This stone allowed us to decipher all the hieroglyphs in Egypt, which had remained undecipherable for hundreds of years.
The euphoria of Egypt was short-lived, though. Word reached him that back in Europe, a new coalition of Austria, Britain, and Russia had formed against France, threatening the Republic. He decided to return to Paris. At the same time, and perhaps even more devastating to him, he learned of Josephine's infidelity. Her affairs were public knowledge on the streets of Paris, yet Napoleon truly seemed to be the last to know. His friends finally confronted him with the news. The effect was shattering. Deeply disillusioned, he wrote to his favorite brother, Joseph.
The veil has been horribly torn asunder. You are the only person remaining to me. I am weary of human nature. I need to be alone and isolated. All feeling is dried up. Napoleon Bonaparte.
Incredibly, the situation got worse when the letter was intercepted at sea by Britain's Admiral Nelson. It was published in the London newspapers, and Napoleon became the laughingstock of Europe. Heartsick, he returned to France, seeking a divorce. This scandal and the threat of divorce caused Josephine to reconsider the marriage. Threatened with losing the relationship, she realized now how important it was to her. Her plea for forgiveness and Napoleon's fear of losing contact with the children, who he now loved as his own, caused him to decide to give the marriage another try. In India, Wellington watched as Napoleon rose to glory, perceiving every one of Bonaparte's accomplishments as a potential threat to England. In time, the British began planning an invasion force that would throw out the French troops Napoleon had left in Egypt. Wellington pulled all strings to get appointed to this task force. It's ironic that right before he was set to sail for Egypt, he came down with a serious fever and could not make the voyage. The ship he was to travel on got caught in a storm at sea and went down with all hands. This random tragedy at the hand of fate left the door open for the two men to clash at a later date. In France, people were rapidly losing faith in their government. After over 10 years of revolution and civil disorder, they wanted a strong leader, someone to calm the waters. Napoleon had performed miracles on the battlefield. Perhaps he could deliver them also in government. The people were looking for a saber that would cut them free of the turmoil. He was the obvious one to wield it. Forming key political alliances and with the threat of force, he seized control of the government with a bloodless coup on November 9, 1799, becoming the first consul of France, a post that carried with it near dictatorial powers. Characteristically, he threw himself into the experience with the same ferocity with which he marched into battle. The ox has been harnessed, now it must plow, he said. By force of will, he created himself. Now he turned that same unyielding will on changing the face of France forever.
Give France new laws, abolish serfdom, bringing in religious toleration. It was as if the sponge of the brain that had been absorbing things for years suddenly was being squeezed. And all of these classical ideas and modern ideas and ideas that were completely fresh and new and were Napoleon's own were coming out together, and he was directing the gullies down which they flowed, and they flowed throughout France.
His physical and intellectual stamina were amazing. At the Fontainebleau Palace, he had his desk moved into his bedroom so he could get up in the middle of the night and work. Often he dictated to as many as 6 secretaries at a time, jumping from subject to subject and never losing his place. His eye for detail impressed all, as did his decisive nature. The 2 questions he constantly asked the most were, is it useful? Is it just? His relationship with Josephine began to sweeten.
The relationship with Josephine got a lot better because Josephine, of course, was getting what she wanted. She had always been very much socially connected, interested in beautiful things. Her husband was now head of the French government. She was, to all intents and purposes, First Lady of France. So she was in the prime social position. Napoleon was getting the ideal mate for his head of state.
A refined taste came at a high price. Napoleon once said she was a woman who could master the art of extravagance. But the changes she encouraged along with his approval left their stamp on France for centuries to come. Paris became the elite of European capitals. Their private moments were spent at their country estate of Malmaison.
It was a retreat. It wasn't one of the big state palaces. It was, to all intents and purposes, Napoleon and Josephine's family home. And it's very grand and beautifully appointed. Malmaison is very much Josephine's house, and her original name, of course, was Rose. And she has roses planted all over the gardens, which are still maintained.
Our imprint was all over it. The only room that seemed to bear Napoleon's stamp was the study. From here he planned his new world order. The success of the changes he made in France became the envy of much of the world. Even Beethoven wrote the Eroica Symphony and dedicated it to him.
Napoleon is looked upon by Europe and many throughout the world as a great hero in this period. The changes that he brings to France are the envy of all democratic-minded peoples, and so you have Beethoven in Vienna and others throughout the Germanies who are looking to France for leadership in what they see from the rights and promise of the French Revolution. It's for the common man, and Napoleon seems to be the savior of the revolution, of the principles of the revolution.
But there was always the paradox of Napoleon. On one hand, he was the Prince of Peace. On the other hand, he played the god of war, enlightening his neighbors and enemies to his progressive policies at the point of a bayonet. He was the ruler of France, but he never ceased to be a soldier, always in the name of peace, Always in the name of the revolution, French armies marched out and dominated Europe. He often described himself as an eagle soaring above the clouds, but his enemies called him a tiger let loose to devour mankind. In India, Wellington continued to watch and wait. Like many, he sensed it was only a matter of time before Bonaparte went too far. His instincts were right. Bonaparte's genius would soon turn to megalomania, and the world would turn to Wellington to stop him. It has been said every nation gets the leader it deserves. The marriage of Napoleon and France seemed to be a match made in heaven.
France and Napoleon in this period fit like a hand in glove. This was a country who had always been looked upon as the grand nation by everybody, and had been humbled somewhat in the 18th century. Now the power of France was unleashed, and here was a man who could take advantage of it. And so the combination of that, a country who was searching for a leader and searching to regain its glory. This was a country that believed to the very depths of its soul in glory, the glory of France. Now it had met its match in Napoleon to lead it to that glory.
Yet the picture seemed too perfect. Napoleon, at the height of his glory, appeared almost superhuman. Epic accomplishments, worldwide fame, hero worship on a massive scale. And yet,
I think Napoleon was a notorious cheater. In games, Napoleon might claim that something was inbounds when he knew full well that it wasn't. He might violate some rules of the games because he could win. Napoleon would do everything that he could to win, even if it meant violating rules. Once he reached his objective, once he won the game, then I think he was willing to admit that he maybe had used a devious path in getting there. But the important thing for Napoleon was to win.
Was he not the master of the impossible? His whole life had been guided by stopping at nothing to attain his goals. On December 2nd, 1804, the world turned its eyes to Paris and Notre Dame Cathedral. Napoleon, as always, in center stage, further consolidated his power when he became Emperor of France. For centuries, imperial coronations had been presided over by the Pope. But at his coronation, Napoleon took the crown himself and placed it on his own head. To many, this marked the point where he started to go out of control. He was only 35 years old. The French people and the Senate had approved this change in status, but to many it seemed an affront. Hadn't the French Revolution been fought in part to overthrow a monarchy? And now he was bringing in another.
In this phase, he seems to be going against a lot of the precepts of the French Revolution, especially as seen by a lot of the intelligent people around the continent. Beethoven, for example, who had written his great masterpiece, the Eroica, for Napoleon, tears it up in disgust when he finds that Napoleon has crowned himself an emperor. Once in power, once with that crown firmly upon his head and all the trappings of an emperor, I think it began to work on his psyche, and maybe it started him down that path to Waterloo.
No one knows Wellington's reaction to the coronation, but like all British subjects, the thought of more power in Bonaparte's hands must have seemed like an imminent threat. More and more Napoleon's troops marched out of Paris and across Europe as he put most of the continent under his thumb.
Securing under French control Italy and the Germanies, Napoleon brings those precepts and freedoms of the French Revolution to the people, but at the same time he brings his garrisons of troops. And as the years go by, those become harder and harder to bear. Tribute must be paid for their upkeep. Napoleon doesn't do anything for free, and so with these freedoms comes a monetary price, and so as the years go by, that becomes a heavy price to pay, and so many of these nations then are going to be willing, when the time is right, to join forces to overthrow the French yoke.
His French Empire was now the greatest in Europe since the Roman Empire. In 1805, Wellington finally set sail from India to England. On the journey home, the ship had to stop over for provisions at the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. This is the island Napoleon would be banished to at the end of his life. Ironically, Wellington stayed in the same house Napoleon temporarily lived in while waiting for his main house to be prepared. He continued on to England, and on September 10th, 1805, he stepped onto British soil for the first time in nearly a decade. He had left the mother country under a cloud, but now he was a spectacular success, returning with a knighthood, fame, and an income in keeping with his new status. Not a man to take defeat lightly, he still had not gotten over the fact that Catherine Pakenham's family had rejected him. And he still had not gotten over her, even though they had not seen each other for 10 years. Uncharacteristically, this most calculating of men made a huge blunder concerning this affair of the heart. Sight unseen, he asked by letter for her hand in marriage. This chivalrous enterprise was a disaster, which he accepted.
And he sees his bride-to-be coming up the aisle. He has not seen her for 10 years. And here's this woman that he's now remembered as being the most beautiful woman in Ireland. And he turns to his brother Gerald and says, "My God, she's grown so ugly over the years." It's incredulous almost that this man who'd been so careful in his military planning had not properly planned out his own wedding.
Wellington, forever a man of his word, followed through with the wedding. But the marriage, by most accounts, was a disaster. Added to this disappointment was the fact that his career now stagnated as he waited for his next big assignment. By 1809, Napoleon became concerned about what would happen to his vast empire after his death. Josephine was now 46 years old and had produced no heirs. Theirs had blossomed into a great romance, but France and his overwhelming ambition were his true mistresses. Everything else had to be pushed aside to serve them. He decided to have the marriage annulled and to marry a younger woman who could produce an heir. They'd been together for 14 years. She begged him to rethink the decision. She pleaded. Finally, when she saw his decision was final, she relented. On December 15th, 1809, she passed out of his life, returning alone to Malmaison. He replaced her with the 18-year-old Archduchess of Austria, Marie-Louise, daughter of Emperor Francis I. In 1811, she gave birth to a son, also named Napoleon, who was given the title King of Rome. More people now began to seriously question whether Napoleon, for all his success, had betrayed the revolution.
One of the flaws in men of genius is that they began to think of themselves as a special race of humans who don't have to deal with these ordinary humans who get in the way of doing things, who waffle here and there, who are never steadfast, who seem to have second-rate minds. So Napoleon is now diminishing everyone around him. And in that process, you have this superego. It is the ego of a genius. In the words of the great Lord Acton many decades later, power does corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
His megalomania even went so far as to have France's great national treasure, the Mona Lisa, moved temporarily from the Louvre to his home, where he could view it every day by himself. He would always say, "I have never been my own master. I have always been governed by circumstances." If this was true, then most of those circumstances were forced on him by the British, his own ego, and now, finally, major errors in judgment. Outwardly, he appeared invincible, going from triumph to triumph. But buried within this maze of glory was a cancerous mistake, one that slowly began to eat away at the grand design of his dream. It was known as the Continental System, and involved the ever-present rivalry and hatred between France and Great Britain. Britain, with its brilliant military commanders like Wellington, was forever the thorn in Napoleon's side. For although he controlled most of Europe, Britain controlled the seas. With her far-flung empire stretching all over the globe, she had every bit the muscle and the capital to defy him. Thinking he could bring them to their knees by paralyzing their economy, he introduced the Continental System. This barred British ships from all ports under French control, and also barred neutral nations from carrying British goods to the European continent. In many ways, this one dictate, amongst the thousands he had made, would be the beginning of the end for him.
It's gonna fail. And it's gonna fail because those people who he's closing it off, the Germans, the Italians, the Russians, the Austrians, the Spanish, it hurts them as much, if not more, than it hurts the English. And so these people who he supposedly has allied himself with are extremely unhappy with the system that he's imposed on them against their will.
Allies and foes conspired to beat the system. There was too much money on the line. Smuggling and blockade running became prevalent. This conflict finally ignited into total war in Portugal and Spain. Now Wellington's time of waiting was over. Here was the new big command he had been dreaming of. Here was his chance to go up against Napoleon. In 1808, Spain, Portugal, and England joined forces against France. Into this picture now came Wellington, who was put in command of the alliance against Napoleon. He and Napoleon never met in combat in Spain. Instead, he faced some of Bonaparte's best commanders. Constantly, he got the upper hand, pushing the French farther and farther off the Iberian Peninsula. In the process, he studied French warfare, learning all their tactics, and he also became an expert at hiding his troops behind the reverse slopes of hills. This experience would prove invaluable at Waterloo. His men's confidence in him was unwavering, yet everyone kept their distance.
He wasn't popular, by the way. It's a question of being respected rather more than liked. There's a big difference on that. Whereas Napoleon, of course, tried to chat with the other ranks. He believed in that, to be friend to friend. Not your Duke of Wellington, and later on, he was slightly the Lord. So, he was in charge, that there's no doubt.
Like Napoleon, he was also fearless in battle. Both men seemed to live charmed lives. So successful was Wellington in Spain and Portugal that Napoleon came to call the problem his Spanish ulcer. It had taken Napoleon little more than a decade to build his empire, yet it's surprising how quickly it came unraveled after the first setbacks. With Wellington hammering away at his troops in Spain and Portugal, and with other alliances forming against him in Europe, he made the catastrophic blunder of invading Russia in 1812. It was here the fates turned on him. For the brutal Russian winter engulfed his army and decimated it as no human foe had ever done. Over half his troops were lost. Now in a vulnerable state, he returned to Europe. His enemies were waiting for him. At the Battle of Leipzig, they overwhelmed his weakened army. In Spain, Wellington finished the job by pushing the remainder of his troops completely off the Iberian Peninsula. For this, England bestowed on him the title Duke of Wellington. Napoleon was completely stunned by these failures. Fortune had smiled on him so often that he couldn't believe she ever might be completely unfaithful. With Allied troops now on the outskirts of Paris, he retreated to Fontainebleau and contemplated what before had been the unthinkable. In this room, he spent what was probably the longest night of his life.
In 1812, Napoleon had a potion made up of poison in case the worst possible fate, befell him. And generally the worst possible fate did befall him. So he goes now to this old poison, and he takes it. What has happened? The poison has lost its potency, and instead he's just violently sick, but lives.
In a way, this was the final insult. He couldn't even commit suicide. On April 11th, 1814, Napoleon abdicated the imperial throne. The Allies oversaw the return of a king of the Bourbon family and placed Louis XVIII in power. The revolution now had come full circle. Down these steps in front of Fontainebleau, Napoleon marched. He made a cheerful goodbye to his troops and then set off to exile on the island of Elba, in a remote corner of the Mediterranean Sea. He was not through, though. The leopard can't change its spots, and in Napoleon's mind, he couldn't ever conceive of losing. Legend has it that he said he would return to France when the violets bloomed. It had taken a force of nature as great as the savage Russian winter to bring Napoleon to his knees. But in human terms, it was clear to all, the man who had softened Bonaparte up was Wellington. Although he had never fought Napoleon, his army had out-battled, out-foxed, and outmaneuvered the best of Napoleon's marshals, proving to all the world that France was not invincible. With Napoleon now on Elba, and the yoke of his tyranny thrown off, worldwide attention now focused on Wellington. For all of those who had ever hated Napoleon, Wellington became the embodiment of the shining knight who had slain the biggest dragon of all. Hero worship and idolization followed him at every turn. Characteristically, he was distrusting and suspicious of all the attention.
I don't think he was a great man for adulation. He didn't take much notice of what people said or did or about him, He didn't particularly care for mine one way or the other.
With Napoleon banished to Elba, The conquering hero Wellington entered Paris as the new British ambassador to France. In the blink of an eye, the great adventure seemed to be over for Bonaparte. Elba was a remote, poverty-stricken speck of an island off the coast of Italy. The combined European powers decreed that this was where the eagle would be caged, perhaps for eternity. They were wrong. Almost from the moment Bonaparte left France, things started to go bad for Louis XVIII. The French people had become strongly attached to the essential achievements of the revolution. Now with Louis in power, everything seemed to be going backwards. Old hatreds were revived, resistance organized, and conspiracies hatched. Soon the attention of France started turning back to Napoleon. Bonaparte felt if he could get back to Paris, perhaps he could exploit the situation. He saw his chance for escape come when the British commissioner in charge of his captivity left the island for a brief trip to Italy. With great cunning, Napoleon took command of 7 small ships, and with his personal guard of 1,000 men, slipped away from the island and set sail for the homeland. He had been on Elba just 11 months, and true to his word, the violets were blooming in France. Bonaparte had always taken risks. This was the greatest gamble of his life. He wasn't sure what to expect. Was the information given correct? Was the timing right? Would the people of France welcome him back? And how would he topple Louis's great armies with just a tiny force of 1,000 men? On March 1st, 1815, he landed on the coast of France and started marching with his troops toward Paris. So uncertain and cautious was he that he chose to go the long, hard way through the Alps, rather than through Provence, which he believed to have royalist sentiments. In Vienna at this time, Wellington was attending a Congress of Allies. He was one of the first at the meeting to get word of Napoleon's daring escape. When it was announced to the assembly, at first they were shocked, and then some burst out laughing. Most were convinced Bonaparte's desperate effort was doomed, and that he would immediately be engulfed by enemies. It was Napoleon who would do the laughing, though. What happened next was perhaps the most amazing event of his already amazing life. As Napoleon marched through the Alps, any doubts he had about how France would receive him were wiped away. All along his path, jubilant people began showing up. Soon men started volunteering to march with him. In Paris, Louis received word of his return. At first he was disbelieving, then he thought perhaps Napoleon had gone mad. Nevertheless, he sent armies out to intercept him. Yet back in the Alps, conspiracy was in the air. Napoleon's small army climbed higher and higher into the mountains, through snow-clogged valleys and freezing cold. Finally, on the roof of Europe, he met the first troops Louis had sent to stop him. The stage was now set for the most dramatic performance of his life. Unarmed, he walked out in front of the king's army and addressed them.
Soldiers who were sent to oppose him cannot withstand his personality. He stands in front of them alone, exposes his breast and says, "If you will shoot your emperor, go ahead." None of them do. No one even thinks about it. They swarm to his colors. His numbers grow. Anyone sent to oppose him falls under his sway.
He continued on toward Paris. From 1,000 men, now a sea of soldiers marched behind him. A joke at the time claimed Napoleon had sent a message to the king.
My dear brother, there is no need to send more troops. I already have enough. Napoleon Bonaparte.
Like a thief in the night, Louis fled the country. On March 20th, just 20 days after landing on the coast, Napoleon marched into Paris, once again the ruler of France. In the street there was pandemonium as jubilant crowds surrounded him. To many, it was as if he had returned from the dead. The impossible had been accomplished. He had recaptured the entire country without a drop of French blood being spilled. At the Congress of Vienna, those who had laughed at Napoleon's daring venture now became alarmed. They were shocked and outraged when told of the success of his miracle march. It was as if the devil himself had escaped and was on the loose. The Tsar of Russia was one step ahead of the rest. He knew what was coming. He turned to Wellington and, referring to the Duke's great success in Spain, exclaimed with extreme seriousness,
It is up to you to save the world again, Tsar Alexander I.
Immediately upon his return, Napoleon made overtures to his European neighbors, indicating his desire for peace. They didn't believe him. Almost immediately, the call went out for an allied army of 1 million men to be raised to march on France and eliminate him forever. This made his next course of action clear. His only hope was to raise his own army faster than they and score a decisive victory before they could get organized. Showing flashes of his old brilliance, he once again attempted the impossible and succeeded. By June 1st, less than 3 months after reclaiming the throne, he had a standing army in place, ready to march, many of them veterans of his previous campaigns. Napoleon's intelligence network reported that in next-door Belgium, British, Prussian, and Belgian troops were gathering for the forthcoming invasion of France. The Prussian and British forces were by far the largest contingents. Wellington had been placed in command of the British troops. Napoleon knew he must move now, before his enemies gained any more strength. With lightning speed, his troops marched into Belgium under a cloak of secrecy and darkness.
With unbelievable stealth, his army has moved to the frontier within miles of his enemies without them even knowing that he's there.
Luck was with him. The location of the British and Prussian armies played right into his hands. The two armies were separated by dozens of miles. The Prussian army was 120,000 troops strong, the British 100,000. Together their combined forces could easily beat his 125,000. But when separated, as they were now, he could move in and defeat one army and then turn around and face the other one separately. He felt his seasoned troops were vastly superior to their quickly thrown together forces. It was a perfect strategic situation for him, offering a classic Napoleonic battle plan of divide and conquer. On June 16th, in a prelude to the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon's forces clashed with the Prussians in the small Belgian town of Ligny. The Prussian army was under the command of Field Marshal Gebhard Blücher.
Blücher, of course, was well into his 70s. Hard drinking, loves women, loves life. He breaks the rules. When he gives his word, that's his bond. Blücher really felt a great shame when Prussia was conquered by Napoleon. He hated Napoleon. He hated everything French.
That day, the French troops badly mauled the Prussians. In the process, Marshal Blücher barely escaped death and capture when his horse was shot from under him.
Here he is, 76 years old, ends up being knocked off his horse, or rather knocked under his horse. His horse is lying on him. He is ridden over by his own men and some of the French. He is then, his men get back to him. They pick him up. He douses himself with gin, rubs it all over himself, and immediately wants to be back in action.
At the same time, Napoleon had sent Marshal Ney to contain the British who were holding the important crossroads at the nearby village of Quatre Bras. For years, Ney had been one of Napoleon's greatest commanders, known to all as the bravest of brave. But here in Belgium, Ney stumbled badly. History has never been able to explain fully why Ney was so indecisive about engaging the British here. Wellington's troops were not in full strength, and if Ney had acted swiftly and with more force, the French could easily have routed them. Instead, he cautiously engaged them. Some believe it was Wellington's spectacular reputation for being cagey that caused this hesitancy. Wellington had outsmarted the French at every turn in Spain, and Ney may have been concerned about marching headlong into one of Wellington's traps. By not making a decisive assault on the British here, it allowed Wellington to begin a maneuver back to a piece of ground he knew he could make a stand on. The battlefield he had in mind was near a town called Waterloo. Napoleon was furious about Ney's failure to contain the British. On June 17th, along with Ney's army, he headed off in pursuit of Wellington. Had they caught Wellington and fought him on that day, the odds are the British would have lost, and there would be no Battle of Waterloo. Instead, a great stroke of luck came Wellington's way, when the heavens opened up, delivering one of the most memorable and fortuitous rainstorms in the history of warfare.
It's the greatest deluge that anyone has seen. It comes down in sheets. Hands can't be seen just in front of the face. And so this torrent stops any chance for the French to begin a battle.
The rains immediately rendered all roads impassable due to mud, and forced the day of the big battle to the 18th. Yet Napoleon's spirits were high. Even though blunders had been made in these preliminary battles, the French ruled the day. He had achieved his objective of driving a wedge even farther between the Prussian and British armies. Yet he underestimated the Prussians and the recovering Blucher. Although they had been defeated on the 16th, Napoleon was wrong in thinking they were through. He had no idea of how much Blucher hated him and hated France. Rather than completely retreating from the area, the Prussians were regrouping. During the stormy night of the 17th, Wellington received word that Blucher was prepared to move heaven and earth in order to get his army to the battlefield at Waterloo the next day.
Wellington has taken the measure. He's met Blucher before. He's taken the measure of the man. And when this old cavalryman says that he's going to be there, Wellington believes it. And that seals his decision to go ahead and stay in his position and face Napoleon at Waterloo on the 18th.
This was a huge gamble for Wellington. If Blucher failed on his promise, the odds were that Napoleon's more experienced army could defeat his. The clock was ticking. June 18th. After a night of almost ceaseless rain, British and French troops met the dawn at Waterloo. At about 10 o'clock, the rain stopped, giving many of the men their first clear view of the killing field. It is one of the great ironies of history that Wellington was already acquainted with this land and was already familiar with its unique features.
As a young boy, before he went to Angers, he spent some time in Brussels, and Waterloo is very close to Brussels. It's an area that he knew well. He'd scouted it. In fact, he said at the time that he had picked this ground earlier and kept it in his pocket.
To the untrained eye, the lay of the land looks nearly flat. But Wellington knew this to be almost an optical illusion, for it was really rolling hills. This cagey observation would have an enormous impact on the way the battle finally played out. Thus, the first move in this great military chess game went to Wellington. It was a vitally important move, for he was the commander who maneuvered himself into the position of choosing the battlefield. And he had also succeeded in luring Napoleon into fighting on it. Finally, now, after 46 years, the two grand masters of war would meet. Wellington, of course, knew and respected Bonaparte's reputation as a military genius. As a man, though, his respect fell off.
He never underestimated him as a soldier. He had a great admiration for his capabilities as a soldier. I don't think he really approved of him in many ways. His conduct towards others. Didn't think he was an honourable man. In many ways, didn't think he was a gentleman in the true sense of the word.
Little is known of Bonaparte's opinion of Wellington, the man. As a soldier, though, his opinion was firm. At breakfast the morning of the battle, Napoleon tongue-lashed his officers who had lost to Wellington in Spain.
Just because Wellington has defeated you, you think he is a great general. I tell you, Wellington is a bad general, that the English are bad troops, and that this is going to be a picnic. Napoleon Bonaparte.
It was with this feeling of confidence and invincibility that Napoleon rode out to the battlefield. This confidence was also born of the fact that he was sure the Prussians were out of the picture and Wellington was his only foe for the day. He had even sent 33,000 troops to shadow the Prussians' activities. In his mind, and in the eyes of his troops, he was still the greatest commander since Alexander the Great, perhaps even greater. It seemed never to have crossed his mind that his opponent, the Duke of Wellington, had never lost a major campaign. Although the rain had stopped, it continued to be a major factor here, especially for the French. The ground was completely saturated with water. Until the battlefield dried out, French artillery would be rendered totally useless. Cannonballs during this era of warfare did not explode. Instead, they ricocheted off the ground, acting like fiery bowling balls that plowed into enemy lines. Under the present conditions, Napoleon knew his shots would be ineffective, as the cannonballs would become mired in mud rather than bouncing along the battlefield. He decided to wait for the ground to dry. For hours, the two armies faced each other, the tension mounting, the clock ticking. Unknown to Napoleon, this delay was giving the distant Prussians 10 miles away time to regroup. Finally, at 11:25 a.m., Bonaparte ordered his artillery to open fire. French artillery was the greatest in the world. Former artilleryman Napoleon always saw to that. Yet Wellington was ready for it. His choice of the battlefield was perfect to defend against cannon attack because of the rolling hills. Wellington had cleverly hid half his army from Napoleon's view. This tactic was known as reversed slopes. It was something Wellington had perfected in Spain. It was one of the major reasons that he had lured the French to this unique spot at Waterloo.
Wellington would hide them behind folds in the hillside. Not only would this mean that the enemy couldn't be quite sure exactly how many troops he had or where they were, but if they fired artillery at them, which was of course the standard way of killing troops at great distances, the cannonballs were not going to hit them. In any case, if they couldn't see them, they didn't know whether they were hitting them or not.
At the same time, French troops moved upon Allied troops located in the Chateau of Hougoumont, located in a strategic corner of the battlefield. This move was meant as a simple diversionary tactic, but soon blew up into a full-scale operation. For the rest of this day, the battle would rage, becoming like an open wound, hemorrhaging French blood and siphoning off much-needed troops. Perhaps even more important at this time was what was happening with Field Marshal Blucher and the Prussian army. Napoleon had sent troops to tail Blucher to make sure the Prussians kept their distance from the main battle. Not needing a victory here, Blucher cleverly used just a portion of his army for engaging the French, and then slipped away with the rest of his men to aid Wellington.
I can't stress too much the courage, the moral courage that Blucher, the Prussian commander, had in order to march to Wellington. He could very easily have decided he had already borne his brunt.
Blucher immediately ran into a catastrophic problem, though, for he hadn't fully anticipated the ordeal that would ensue when he tried to move tens of thousands of men, cannons, and horses along 10 miles of road clogged with rivers of mud. Serious doubts were now raised as to whether Blucher would be able to keep his promise to Wellington. At about 1:30, a determined Napoleon unleashed the full force of his fabled infantry on the center of the British line. Divide and conquer was always at the heart of his battle strategies. Facing a hail of fire from the British rifles, 16,000 French troops reached the crest of the hill and nearly broke through the British line. The fighting here was as ferocious as ever recorded in Napoleonic warfare.
The sound of bullets against the breastplates of the French was like a hailstone against a window. British soldier.
Just at the most crucial moment, like in some schoolboy's fantasy battle, the British cavalry came to the rescue.
These are big men on big horses, and they smashed through the French infantry, driving it back in great disorder. This is probably Britain's greatest cavalry charge of the entire Napoleonic Wars.
The fact that Wellington continued to hold his line together against superior French forces was a testament to his skills. All the lessons he had learned in Spain were paying off now.
One of the things you learn in warfare is that after you're victorious year after year after year, the enemy learns what your strengths are, and then learns not to make those mistakes anymore. So now the Prussians nor the British forces are falling into the old traps that Napoleon used to set for them. They know that he wants to divide and defeat in detail. They will not divide.
Both Napoleon and Wellington were renowned for brilliant battle strategies. Yet here at Waterloo, the great attacker met the great defender and canceled each other out. Soon finesse went out the window, and the conflict became what Wellington called a pounding match.
He remained very cool. He's supposed to have said when things were very bad, he said to some of the infantry, "Hard pounding gentlemen, we'll see who pound the longest, you know."
Now Napoleon received word that the Prussians had been spotted miles away, marching toward the battle. Blucher and his troops were doing the impossible. At first, Bonaparte was unbelieving, but then reality set in. He would now have to fight the rest of the day with one eye over his shoulder. This still did not shake him, though. Always the gambler. His army had fought out of tougher spots before. He still firmly believed that if he could beat the British, he would also be able to turn his army around and defeat the Prussians on the same afternoon. He had defeated two armies before, on numerous occasions. The only thing he knew he couldn't do was fight them both simultaneously. Time was getting tight. It was imperative now that he dispose of the British immediately. Napoleon's primary battlefield commander was Marshal Ney. Even though Ney had blundered earlier in his encounter with Wellington at Quatre Bras, Napoleon still left him in charge of operations. Ney was the kind of leader whose men would follow him into hell, and that is what they now did. For he erred again when he perceived a movement in Wellington's line as being a withdrawal. Smelling blood, he ordered a massive cavalry charge against the British without the aid of artillery or infantry support. Wave after wave of French cavalry charged, 16,000 horses and riders in all. The scene was one of uncontrollable frenzy and movement, a surreal moment of warfare.
No man present could have forgotten in the afterlife the awful grandeur of the charge. An overwhelming, long-moving line, ever advancing, glittering like a stormy wave of the sea when it catches the sunlight. The very earth seemed to vibrate beneath the thundering hooves. British soldier.
Yet it was a mistake. Wellington had not been withdrawing, only readjusting. The British quickly formed their troops into infantry squares and braced for the onslaught. This porcupine defense was extremely effective because Ney had made the mistake of not supporting his cavalry charges with infantry and artillery protection. The British successfully thwarted the charges, but the price on both sides was viciously high. The battlefield was now filled with dead bodies, and tension was mounting even higher. One British soldier described the scene.
I had never heard of a battle in which everybody was killed, but this seemed to be the exception, as all were going in turns.
At 4 o'clock, the Prussians began to emerge, and by 5 they had taken over a nearby village and had started to tear into the right flank of Napoleon's army. The main portion of their forces was still to come, but Napoleon now had to siphon off thousands of reserves to halt the initial group. Things were definitely going Wellington's way. He had so far successfully blocked every one of the French maneuvers.
Wellington was having a typical Wellingtonian day. He knew what had to be done, he knew where he needed to be, and that's where he was. Staff officers were falling all around him. He was, as usual, in the midst of shot and shell, but again, miraculously, nothing touched him.
For Napoleon, it was different. For the first time on the battlefield, he seemed indecisive, even lethargic. He and Wellington were both 46, but Wellington seemed young at 46, Napoleon old. Controversy has raged forever about the state of Napoleon's health on that day.
Is he simply sick and going back to rest and recover some energy to come back? Napoleon's been on an active campaign for all of his adult life. I mean, this guy has done more so, crammed more into his 46 years than any comparable man of the age. It would be hard to find a man in history who's had such an active life.
Wellington knew, though, that like a wounded animal backed against a wall, Napoleon might be most dangerous when cornered. Wellington also knew Napoleon had a potential knockout punch in reserve, the Imperial Guard.
The Imperial Guard, especially the Old Guard, are men who have served extremely valiantly. They've all won awards for valor in their previous fights. They've never been defeated. On every battlefield when Napoleon's had to administer the coup de grace, it's the Old Guard that's done it for him.
Although he was using part of the Guard to fend off the Prussians on his flank, he still had not called the main body of their troops into action. This may be one indication that he was still positive about winning the battle. Perhaps the most strategic spot on the battlefield was a farmhouse called La Haison, held by the Allies. Still not using the Imperial Guard, Napoleon ordered Ney to take it at all costs. Ney finally did something right when he properly coordinated an infantry, cavalry, and artillery attack on the building, driving the Allies out. Was Napoleon going to accomplish the impossible again? For all practical purposes, the battle was now even, still there to be won or lost. Suddenly it was Wellington who was in crisis. By losing the farmhouse and being weakened by the French cavalry charges, the center of his main line was now vulnerable. The battle was so close now that Wellington told one of his men, "Give me Blucher, or give me the night." There comes a decisive moment in every battle and in every life. A moment when one decision can make or break everything. That moment had now come for Napoleon. It had been a long and amazing road he had traveled from Corsica to Waterloo. Whether he would continue down that victorious road, all boiled down to one decision he made now. Ney requested the Imperial Guard to finish the job against Wellington. Napoleon refused him.
Oops. Huh. Where do you expect me to find them? Do you think I can manufacture some? Napoleon Bonaparte.
Perhaps Napoleon was right in refusing him. Ney had made too many errors in judgment during the campaign. The failure at Quatre Bras, the disastrous cavalry charges. Napoleon no longer had confidence in his judgment. In making this decision, Napoleon let slip away perhaps his best chance for victory. This allowed Wellington enough time to regroup. Instead, Napoleon used a portion of the Guard to check the Prussians on his flank. This maneuver took less than an hour. Then he turned to a last-ditch stand against Wellington. He knew he had to succeed now because the bulk of the Prussian army would be there at any time. At 7 o'clock, Napoleon led the mighty Imperial Guard out himself.
He led them in person until his staff persuaded him that no, he must not put himself in jeopardy, that even if they won the battle, if he were killed, then everything they'd been fighting for would be at an end.
And so he turned them over to Ney to march on Wellington.
Wellington's deployed troops were in place. They were behind the reverse slope. They were laying down. They were loaded. Everything that he could do, he had done.
Dusk was falling as the French marched forward up the ridge. The future of France was on the line, and the fate of Europe for the next 100 years. The British silently held their place. Wellington was right there with them. He chose a position alongside one of his finest generals, Peregrine Maitland.
Here was defeat coming right towards them. But they were coming on in column. As long as they kept in column, there was a chance. And as the French Imperial Guard column reached the top of the slope, Wellington, who was there by the guards, shouted, "Now, Maitland, now's your time."
The Guard can't take it. They take the pounding initially, they move forward, men step forward in ranks. The discipline is incredible. These are Napoleon's best troops, but the pounding is just too much.
The Guard's retreating. It's never happened. This doesn't happen. The Imperial Guard had never been defeated. And as the Imperial Guard went back, all this great enthusiasm that the rest of the French army had felt was turned back on them, because now the Guard was retreating. The French army just began to disintegrate.
Next, the British infantry charged. Outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outgeneraled, panic ensued as the French broke ranks and ran. At the same time, the bulk of the Prussian army arrived and flooded the field. It was hopeless for Napoleon to attempt to regroup. Under the protection of the Guard, he abandoned the field and headed back to Paris. Blucher and Wellington met and congratulated each other with great exuberance. Later, Wellington would call the battle the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. As the sun went down, darkness engulfed Napoleon's army and his dream. On this day, he left 50,000 dead or wounded in his wake. In his abandoned coach, they found a declaration of victory already printed that he intended to distribute that night in Brussels. Yet it was Wellington who had won the Battle of Titans.
In the end, Wellington won the Battle of Waterloo because he outgeneraled Napoleon. Napoleon was great. He had a great mind, but there at Waterloo, all of that seemed to desert him. And it was as if everything that was drained from Napoleon was fed into Wellington. Wellington did not put a foot wrong. He had all the troops where he needed them, when he needed them. His ally, Blucher, turned up on time as he had promised. Everything worked.
The effect of the battle would reverberate around the globe for almost a century to come.